Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I am Joan Johnston. I'm the Textiles, Fashion and Crafts Specialist for XpoNorth. So welcome to our session this afternoon on inventing, designing and developing innovative products. I'm absolutely delighted to have Gareth Jones join us today. Gareth and I actually go back to our students' days, which is quite some time ago, and it's been great catching up on all the products and the design, development, etc. that we've both been doing at different ends of the country. Because Gareth's based down in Somerset, and obviously I'm based up on the Highlands and Islands. So Gareth has prepared a presentation around the work that he's done and really sharing his learnings over that time. Many of the brands and the products that he will talk about you will recognise. So it's a really great opportunity for anyone who's either involved in innovating new products or planning to work on something. Great opportunity to hear and benefit from Gareth's experience. We will have a Q&A session at the end. It's probably the best if you can drop any questions you might have into the question box, and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to hand over to Gareth, and we'll go from there.
Thank you very much, Joan. Thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be here. So I'm just going to share, if I can, share my screen.
That's it.
Okay, so I'll give you a bit of background about who I am, because it's very much coloured my view of my view of design and my experience. So I originally trained at Loughborough University as a mechanical engineer. I like making things, and it seemed like an obvious thing to do. And I was sponsored through my course by Rolls-Royce and Bentley. So back in the 80s, this is the sort of product they were making. And you can see top right, the sort of thing they had me doing, designing and making all sorts of interesting sort of mechanical things. But I had a real passion for, I didn't know what it was called at the time. I like to invent things. And Rolls-Royce was very much, we called it dead men's shoes. The only way you ever progressed was when the eldest person either died or retired, and everyone would sort of shuffle along. So very, very frustrating. So I took myself off after working at Rolls-Royce for a year I was very lucky to get a place at the Royal College of Arts. And it's very unusual for an engineer to actually to be able to go and spend 2 years in a place like this. So it's in central London, just to the south of Hyde Park, next to the Albert Hall. And you can see top right there, it was like walking into kind of like a beehive, just an absolute incredible energy level. And they're very cramped, just full of people, very noisy, but just a fantastic place and fantastic people. So I spent 2 years there and absolutely loved it. I learned a huge amount. I learned about the process of design and innovation, or started to learn about the process. And when I left there, I had been introduced to James Dyson, and was really taken by both him and his approach and what he was doing. And this is where his company was based in those days. It was in Somerset, in the garden of his house, just outside Bath. It's the coach house. And the office you can see there, that's where we worked. So I started there in 1991, and my first job was to design, be part of the team. So with two friends there and James, we designed the DC01. So that's Dyson's first vacuum cleaner that he put his name on. And from that, the whole business took off. Within 18 months, it was the best-selling vacuum cleaner in the UK, and it just went on from there. So by the time I left Dyson, it was about 15 years later, it looked like this. The company had moved up into Wiltshire, had built a huge sort of design centre and factory, and we worked on all manner of projects. So I was particularly involved in the washing machine project. So I've spent a lot of time designing laundry systems, as you'll see later on. So that was a really interesting journey, just to see how you could grow an innovative business and try and keep that sort of magic element to it. And there's probably a lot of reasons why Dyson has managed to do that and has managed to keep innovating. So what I do now after leaving Dyson. I run a business called Freshworks, and what we try and do, we try and come up with elegantly simple solutions to complex technical problems. Just an example here, this is not quite a waterless washing machine, but a nearly waterless washing machine that we worked on for a number of years, designing for a client, and a match dryer. We've also worked on just a complete range of products. This was a 5-axis driving simulator that some of the Formula One teams use to train their drivers. So we designed that from scratch. So you climb in it and it moves around in response to the software. So it makes you actually feel, if you wear a headset or use a screen, it makes you feel like you're actually in the car. We've also done more consumer-based products. We designed pushchairs for mamas and papas. So we've done a fair few products like that. And some quite interesting product for developing countries. So this is a waterless toilet we worked on for a company called Luwat. They eliminate the water, they collect the waste, they digest it, turn it into gas, make electricity. So a really interesting concept. And most recently, we've developed this hand-powered washing machine for a charity called the Washing Machine Project. And it was quite a tough brief. We had about 8 weeks and we could only use materials that you could buy out of one supplier's catalogue. So quite a difficult constraint, but we successfully built this hand-powered washing machine that washes and spins, interestingly. And when we tested it, bottom right there, you can see the test swatches. It actually washed better than our professional Miele machine we have in our lab. So interesting, it just shows what you can actually do with some fairly basic materials. And we also get to work on some fairly interesting and diverse stuff. This was, you might recognise these if you've seen the film Warhorse. So when Steven Spielberg made the film, they wanted a couple of howitzers, but you can't go out and buy them anymore. So we built these from scratch, found some plans and scaled it up, and then hired a very big workshop and actually built them. So a complete range of products. But the interesting thing is the process that we use that underpins all of our work is the same. So what I wanted to do is just share some of our thinking, if you like. It's a very personal view. But hopefully, if you work in this sort of space, some of it might chime. The one thing before I do that, I just wanted to talk about how I got into. I work for the Design Council, and I've often worked as a visiting professor in London and in Bath. But there was something called the Cox Review of Creativity back in 2005, a long time ago. But it was a study of the UK's sort of creativity industry and capability. And the conclusions were that if you want to succeed in business, you have to innovate. And the best innovators, actually 75% of their revenue comes from products not in existence 5 years ago. So really important to innovate. And there's a real sort of interdependence between companies and the creative community. They both need each other. And there was a conclusion at the end that the creative understanding of both business people and students, technology students, science students, business students, needs to be improved. The result of all of this was they funded a mentoring program with the Design Council. So I worked for a number of years as a design associate, going around to startups and small businesses and helping them to use design thinking and innovation and creativity to actually improve their business. And the reason I share this is this little thumbnail down on the left. It's the only design process that I've seen that actually really, I think, captures the creative design process. So basically, it's called the double diamond. You start on the left and you move across to the right. So you'll see on the left, that little red dot's a problem. And there's another problem definition in the middle and the solution on the right. It's broken down into 4 different phases: discovery, definition, development, and delivery. But I'll talk through those. So the first process that you go through, if you're given a problem, you research it. So you do lots of thinking, creative thinking, user research, secondary research. But you can see there, these little dots represent sort of avenues of thought or ideas, and there are multiple ideas. You don't just work on one idea, you actually explore the problem. And you can see there it's a divergent phase. All as you move forward, you're coming up with more and more ideas. And the best way to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas, and then you can actually choose the best. And what you do in the next stage, which is the definition phase, is you converge. So it's a convergent process here. You actually analyze what you've got, And what you end up at the end isn't a solution, but you end up with a much better understanding of the problem that you actually need to solve. And often that's very different from the problem you start with. And you follow that with another divergent phase, which is development, which is taking your problem definition and again, exploring ways where you can actually solve that problem. So again, multiple ideas usually pursued, and they're the little sort of snail-like shapes. This is an iterative process. So you come up with an idea, you build it, you test it, and you refine it. And that very, very much that chimes with me. That's exactly the way that we work. Designs don't appear fully formed. They always take iteration. And when you've actually developed a number of possible solutions, the last thing to do is to actually to narrow down and to work up a final concept. So again, conversion. So it's really interesting that chimes with me, because parts of the process are very divergent. You've got to be a bit right brain, and then parts of conversion, which is left brain. And most people are usually more comfortable on one side or the other, but where I sort of trained, the engineering degree and then the art college, we had to do both. And so I think that's a really good model that just encapsulates the creative design process. The interesting things about it, that the problem you solve is sometimes or usually not the problem you actually start with. And I'll give you an example of that later. And you need to be right brain, divergent, conversion, which is interesting. And ideas always need to be iterated. They never come fully formed. We use sketches, modeling, prototypes just to work things up and refine and improve. And it usually takes a bit of time to get things working to the level you want them to. And usually this is a very, very sort of simplified view, but this process continues from the start all the way to the finish. There's always this sort of mix of divergent and convergent thinking. Now, talk about this, solving the right problem. The first two phases, if you like, the discovery and definition, we tend to think of that as defining the what and the why. What are you trying to do and why are you doing it? And that often leads you to actually question whether the problem you're being asked to solve is the right one, which is why you end up in the middle with a slightly different problem. And the bit on the right really is, well, how are you going to solve it? That's much more, if you like, much more mechanical. The difficult bit often is actually coming up with the problem to solve. So a good example of that, we work for a company up in the north, and they had a concept for washing clothes using beads. So you take most of the water out, you use plastic beads, and they'd come up with an incredibly complex way of doing it, where you put the beads into a drum, they fall out the bottom, you've got to pump them back up. To convert a machine, you had to take the whole thing to bits. It cost a fortune. And they asked us to scale it down. But the first thing we did was say, well, actually, there's a better way of doing it. And we came up with this concept on the right of just adding some injection molded parts inside the existing drum. So don't change the machine at all. Just leave it as it is, but keep all the beads. They live in the drum, and you can dispense them and harvest them using this strange arrangement of mouldings. And we built, in a day, a little cardboard model that we used to actually prove the technique worked. So we got the cost of converting a machine down from about $10,000 to probably about $500. And as a result of that and the patents that generated, they've managed to secure a huge investment, and they've actually got people in their license. So for me, it's a good example of the problem you're asked to solve isn't always the right problem you should be focusing on. And I put this slide in because it sort of, I think it really chimes, having worked with James Dyson, that if you want successful products and services, you need to address these three dimensions. So it's sort of quite top level, but there's obviously, from a design point of view, an engineering point of view, the technical, what's feasible. But you also have to balance that with commercially what's viable. And on top of those two, you've got the social sort of dimension, what's desirable, what do people want and what will they buy? And for any successful product or service or even company, I think you actually have to balance these three dimensions simultaneously. And in the middle there is the sweet spot. If you get it right, you have products and services that actually tick all the boxes. So when you're creating new products, you can't just do it from a technical perspective. There's always a temptation for designers and engineers to do that. But if you ignore the other two, you will come up with products that just won't they won't fly, people won't buy them, or they won't be cost effective. And it's very rare to get people with this combination of skills. You know, I could think of Isambard Kingdom Brunel is probably a really good example. Steve Jobs, to maybe the same degree, and James Dyson I've worked with, and he very much can work comfortably in these 3 dimensions. And something else, from maybe it's a very design centric view, but I always think of the design activity as being an interpreter. We've often worked with clients where they have all of these different functions, but they don't communicate. They don't really speak the same language. They don't particularly get on. Usually there's a healthy tension between the marketing department and the sort of the technical, the research and engineering. And design tends to sort of have to sit in the middle and to make sure that all of these functions are working effectively. And this, if you are looking to innovate in a business, to build an innovative business, it's really important to manage the relationships between these different departments, because often companies are structured in silos, that people will sit in their silo and they don't tend to like working, they're not comfortable working across functions. Whereas for successful projects, you actually need to have all of these different functions working together, usually co-located. So a project has its own finance person or its own marketing person, its own salesperson. And I've seen companies that don't do that and companies that do that. And the ones that actually build project teams and are very multi sort of disciplined are far more successful. So I think how you actually, the organizational structure and how particularly how you structure projects has a huge impact on how easy it is to actually to come up with innovative new products. This was a great example of a company I worked with in London, Dalston. So Roland Lamb on the left there was a student at the RCA and came up with this idea for a flexible silicon keypad, and joined the incubator at the RCA, raised some money, and eventually got to the point where he started a very successful business. And I did some consulting there, but it was interesting because it was incredibly multidisciplinary. It was incredibly multicultural. Just for example, the chief people officer was a professional dancer, and Roland himself, I think he studied either the classics or philosophy. So you had just an incredible mix of people with very, very different technical and sort of business backgrounds and very different cultural backgrounds, but all brought together by this real focus on design and innovation. They did some great things, like every lunchtime they would all eat together. You know, even when there was about 50 people there, they'd have one big long table and everyone, including all the visitors, they'd all sit down and they'd share a meal together, which is a great way of building a really strong sense of identity, you know, and actually building the culture that you actually want to, you know, you need to innovate. And that's something that as companies grow, it can often get lost. I'm sharing this because this is from my time at the RCA. I went in there as an engineer and I was dumped in a studio full of people who'd had more of an arts and design training. And I think it encapsulates the difference between the two, if you like, the two routes into design. So if you move from the left, which is the known and understood, over to the right, which is new and novel, engineers and scientists and maybe business people, they're all taught to actually, everything's about having proof and evidence. You know, you can't sort of just take a leap into the unknown. You've got to take these small, solid steps and work forwards from what you know is possible. And you'll make progress. So you'll actually move from, you know, a position of something that's known, maybe into something that's sort of less known. But by contrast, the sort of designer and the artist would actually take these giant leaps into the unknown and say, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this, and have not be constrained by what is possible, not get bogged down in the detail. They just have this freedom of imagination and thought. And inevitably, things don't always work, so you have to work backwards. So you end up maybe at a similar point, but there's always this just little difference between the two. So I think if that, to me, illustrated, there's two different ways of approaching things. One is to actually to be very sort of cautious and restrained almost, and the other is just to take these big leaps into the unknown. And that's something I don't think there's enough of in technical education, engineering and science. It's all very convergent. It doesn't encourage uncertainty and risk and free thinking. It sort of knocks it out of people. But that I thought, if you're running a business, it's important to sort of be aware of this, that we tend to sort of be conditioned by our education and maybe where we work to adopt this cautious approach. I think there's a lot to be gained by actually being a bit more ambitious. Just an example, we worked on a project for an American company designing a fuel pump to put petrol in your car. And we had an engineer working with us whose approach to the problem was maths. So sitting down and doing loads of equations. And then the designers on the team, actually, it was more about sitting down and sketching and brainstorming and not being constrained by the maths, but just thinking about things slightly differently. And in the end, we came up with a fairly neat and simple solution, but it was from adopting a fairly free thinking approach rather than sort of trying to understand it in infinite detail. So I'll talk briefly about the tools that we use, very personal. There's lots of tools out there for design, innovation, whatever. These are the things that work for us. And the first thing is actually, the best design products come from understanding the people that will actually use them. And if you're designing products, you're a user. If we design push chairs or the other things we've done, we're all users to some degree. But you really need to get under the skin of people that are going to be your users. And user-centered design is about actively engaging with the end users and getting insight. It's not asking them questions. It's much more subtle than that. It's about gathering insights that you actually feed into the design process from the earliest stage. And this is really interesting, that we know people don't do what they're supposed to do. No one reads the manual. And people don't do what they say they do. If you interview people, they'll tell you often what they think you want to hear. And strangely, people don't actually do what they think they do. People don't do what you think they do. So often you can be surprised, and strangely, people don't do what they think they do. So they'll tell you how they use a product or how they use a service, but actually when you film them or watch them, they do something different. So you really can't trust just sort of talking to people and asking questions and questionnaires. It's really interesting doing some research on washing machines. Just this, I thought was really interesting. The bottom pitch there, we saw a lot of dials with like red dots on, or like people had added markers. And that's because although people claim that they know how the machine works, often it's usually, unfortunately, the lady of the house ends up having to do the washing. And if she goes away and it's husbands or children that have to use the machine, they couldn't understand it. It's just too complex. So often you'd see people putting red dots on and say, look, just turn the dial to the red dot and press go. So it was very interesting just to understand. It was a little insight into how complex the controls on some of these washing machines are and how people really didn't understand them. So just looking at that another way, if you compare traditional market research, which is what lots of companies would do, against a user-centered approach, and you looked at the number of people you talk to, the subjects, the facts you'll gather, and the inspiration. With traditional market research, you send out lots of questionnaires, you talk to lots of people, you get lots of facts, but from a design point of view, there's very little inspiration in that. It doesn't give you an idea of what delights people or what they'd really want. If you do use the user-centered approach, you actually sort of engage with a much smaller number of people, but in much more depth. And you don't really get many facts. You're not interested in the facts, but it's much richer doing that. You actually gather a lot more inspiration for how you can improve a product or a service, either addressing existing problems or thinking of something completely new. So there's a lot of huge amount of published sort of work on user-centered design, but it's really important. And customers rarely say they want an innovative product. They can't imagine what doesn't exist. That's what the design process is about, is giving people things they didn't know they wanted. This is just some of the techniques we use. We work with a company designing surgical instruments, and they have to be used by surgeons, and there's a strict pecking order with surgeons, you have design surgeons at the top, and they become, as you get more junior, they have less of a voice, but they're equally important because they're usually the ones doing the operations. So rather than being just listening to the sort of top surgeons, if you like, we used a variety of tools and techniques to try and hear the voices of a much broader range of people, not just the surgeons, but the scrub nurses and all the support staff in the operating theatre. So as I say, there's an absolute wealth of information out there about different techniques you can use to understand your users. And I encourage anyone who's actively in the design business, really worth understanding more about it. We did that when we designed the milking cluster for Avon Rubber. We had to go, the only way to understand it is to go and use it, and it's used to milk cows. So we got up early, we went, met the farmer, and we spent a day milking cows, which put me off milk for a while, but really good at just generating an understanding of who your customer is and what their challenges are. So the second tool that we use, and I can't stress how important this is just sketching. I have a team here, and their natural inclination is to come in and jump on a computer and use CAD. And it drives me mad because you can draw at least 10 times faster than you can use a computer. It just encourages much more breadth. It's much more flexible. You can iterate. And you can capture incredible, look at these. This is Leonardo da Vinci, flying machines. And this middle example is Alec Isigonis designed the Mini just in his sketchbook. So you can capture with pen and paper some really sophisticated ideas. Once you've committed something to paper as well, it facilitates a really rich conversation. And we do it, just examples on the right. That's how we work. When we're at the beginning of the design process, come up with lots of ideas, we can generate easily 100 ideas in the morning, which is what you need to actually then to start whittling them down and refining them. The second thing we do a lot of is prototyping and testing. So if you're going to fail, you need to fail fast. If an idea doesn't work, if it's got drawbacks that you haven't anticipated, it helps to know that early on. So we spend a lot of time early on actually building just working prototypes, crude, we call them breadboards or works-like models. So the top left is the quick prototype we built for the hand-powered washing machine. But it gave us the confidence that the principle was sound and the gearing worked, and it told us everything we needed to know. So not only do these things give you technical feedback, but you can actually get users engaged at this stage and say, what do you think of this? Is that handle, easy enough to move, or is it too stiff, or is it too fast? And that's really, really useful early in the process while you've still got time to make changes. So a lot of our time is spent designing and building rigs. We worked on an aircraft seat, the next generation of aircraft seat for British Airways, and spent a couple of years on it. But the start of that, we modelled everything in cardboard, just because it's very, very quick. We could cover a lot of ground quickly, but it meant that we could actually talk with the rest of the design team and share our thoughts and get their input without having the cost and the time of having to build the bottom sort of prototype, which is made in metal and much more functional. And so in terms of just capturing and articulating ideas, both back to yourself and to other people, prototypes, particularly the low resolution ones, are worth waiting on. Interestingly, when we designed the DC01 and the first Dyson vacuum cleaner, we built the whole thing in cardboard before we actually went near computers. So we actually sat down and spent a week building a whole cardboard model of a vacuum cleaner just to work out how many parts we needed and how they all fit together. And the next tool we use just all the time is brainstorming, brain writing, which is its effectiveness is out of all proportion to how sort of simple and easy to use it is. And just as an example, often with students, I'll get a coffee cup to the bottom right and just ask them, give them a minute and say, come up with as many uses for a coffee cup as you can. And you get the usual sort of, the flower pot, and maybe you could make a sort of with a piece of string, make a telephone, all sorts of things. But usually in a minute, even the brightest students, they'll struggle to get more than about 15 ideas. But if you go around a class of maybe a dozen students and add all those ideas up, often together, collectively, they come up with 200 ideas for how you could use your coffee cup. And that's the power of brainstorming. It's a group activity, and what you're after is quantity of ideas, not quality. So the broad rules are, it's about quantity. You don't criticize any idea. It's very easy to shoot things down. You can do that later. But when you're doing it, you have to be very, very positive. You can build on each other's ideas. You work visually, ideally sketch ideas out rather than write them. Keep the session fairly short, keep the energy level up, and then you review and organize it later. It is incredibly powerful, very, very simple. A great way of actually exploring problems. And the last one is just, we use a lot, is analogies. So this comparison between things that have sort of similar features but in different contexts. So we designed a screen a number of years ago now that was like a large video tile that you could put on the outside of, you could turn buildings effectively into a giant sort of screen by adding these tiles. And you'll see there that the cells are all hexagonal. And the reason for that, if you look in nature, when nature deals with optics, things like the compound eye of a fly, all of the little individual cells are hexagonal. And the reason for that is, for a given number of cells, you can get about 18 or 20% more resolution from the image that you see. So nature has already solved this optical problem using these hexels, as we call them. So it's just a nice, usually if you're working on a problem or looking for something new, nature has solved a similar problem somewhere. If not, then someone else will probably have done something similar in a different context. So that's always worth looking for. So very, very, those are the tools we use most. There's a lot of them out there, but it does, if you are in the innovation business, if you design, it's always worth just stepping back and reflecting on how you work and the tools and techniques that you use. And the last thing I wanted to say was just, can you teach creative and innovation? I've worked in colleges, I've worked with businesses, and you can teach. Some people say, well, I'm not creative, but actually I think if you create the right environment, most people that we've come across, you can actually get them to be creative. But if you're teaching creativity in an academic environment, there are some things that you really need to make it work. I worked at Bath University, and it was very much, the culture there was about lectures and about talking and not much about doing. Design, innovation, creativity, it doesn't really respond to that. You've got to get hands-on. You really need to practice it to learn how it works. And to do that, you really need studio space. You need wall space for making your work visual, for sharing it. You need room to make prototypes. You need as well to create a relaxed environment. It's not about getting it right all the time. It's okay to make mistakes, and often the mistakes are what leads to the insights that create the breakthroughs. And when you're making stuff, you need just simple low tech. We use paper, card, glue, and tape, and then you can actually articulate some quite sophisticated ideas quite simply with 3D models. And it works best if you have groups, ideally groups that you mix up, so break up, put people with strangers, so they're actually forced to deal with people from different sort of backgrounds, with different experiences, and it tends to well, if you can do that, when you have those conditions, it's remarkable the results you can actually achieve. And my belief is that creativity should be part of the curriculum, not just for designers and those studying sort of arts courses, but particularly for engineers and scientists and people on business courses, because creativity is about solving problems, and actually you can translate those techniques directly into a lot of different business contexts. But the final point I make there, it was quite interesting working at Bath. I worked in the mechanical engineering department, and they had an architecture department next door. Now, the architecture department, they built huge studios for their architecture students to work in. And the dean of engineering was always pulling his hair out, saying they make such a mess. I want to close it down. Every time I walk through there, it's a mess. I looked at it and I thought, this is brilliant. There's an energy level in here. There's a sort of level of creativity that's fantastic. And the way they did that, they actually, rather than had full-time staff, they had about 80 practicing architects and civil engineers who would come in and would mentor the students. And I think if you're trying to teach design and creativity and innovation, that is a much better model to follow, to actually have practitioners who come in and share their experience and share their thoughts on a problem you're working on, than to have a very academic approach. I think it really does respond to the input from practitioners. And then lastly, the business, can you actually go into a business and teach them about creativity? And it's interesting because we all start out very creative. We were all children once, and children are fantastically curious and fantastically creative because they don't know why they shouldn't be. But over time, that curiosity and that sort of creativity is knocked out of us by education and then by work. And you end up where people are conditioned to think that, they're just not creative. And we've done a number of workshops now where, this example was Gillette, where I knew the design manager, and he was really frustrated because he had just the best facilities in the world. They had the best computers, the best workshop, the best materials, brilliant staff. And he'd come in the morning, they'd all be sitting in front of a computer with a cup of coffee, and there was no interaction, no energy. So we took them out of their environment for a day. We ran a workshop where we went through those basic brainstorming and then prototyping and modeling, and just got them in 2 days to design and come up with some new concepts. And it was incredible. It energized that team. So it was really interesting to see in a short space of time, a very modest resource, what you can actually do. But if you want to create build this creative environment in a workplace, you've got to have really a design-focused culture. So design has to be in there somewhere. It's what translates these ideas into sort of products and services. And you have to have top-down support. It's got to be supported from the top of the business. It isn't something you can sort of just do on the quiet. I think the really successful businesses, it permeates their whole culture top to bottom. Having the multidisciplinary teams, if you have everyone from the same background with the same experience, it really narrows the range of ideas that get generated. So it really helps to mix it up, to have people from different backgrounds with different experiences and different skills. And they have to be given permission to challenge the norm and to go off and explore. Too often I hear people say, well, we don't do that way around here. It's just soul destroying. You think, well, why not? Why can't we challenge that? You've got to be able to tolerate risk and uncertainty. If you're designing new products, there is inherently a degree of risk in coming up with new things. You can't foresee all the ways they might not work. You can mitigate that by doing lots of early prototyping and the things I've talked about, building test rigs and actually talking to users earlier on. But you have to have a culture that tolerates that. Dyson was a great example, that he was prepared to put his money where his mouth was, and actually, to invest in projects that, down the line, after investing maybe quite a lot of time and money, might not see the light of day. But as a result of that, he pushed boundaries far further than anyone else. And lastly, there's lots of design tools out that you can use. It's not rocket science. It's fairly simple. It is remarkably simple, but you just need to use them in the right way. I think it really helps to have external input if you're working in a business, to have someone come in from the outside with a fresh perspective and fresh challenges and just fresh approaches to old problems. That's what we love doing as consultants, is going in and just trying to understand the business and say, well, why are you doing it like that? Why don't you do it? Why not try something different? There's a lovely quote there from a guy called Edward Turner, who was a famous motorcycle designer back in the 50s, designed some really beautiful bikes. But he said, the best progress is likely to be made by the person who doesn't know why the job can't be done. And that comes back to that point about innately, there's a creativity in all of us, that the child in all of us. Children don't know why you can't do things, so they just go ahead and try it. And often, that's the sort of, if you like, the start point of some really great ideas. Someone who doesn't know why it won't work but tries it anyway. So that was all I wanted to talk about. There's my contact details there. Anyone who's got any wants to follow up or has any further questions, more than happy to get in touch.
Great. Thank you, Gareth. Thanks so much. Really, really interesting. I mean, the number of projects you've worked on, the sort of cultural reference, the team building, just so relevant for actually lots of manufacturing companies, not just obviously people problem solving and design. So really, really good. So I'm just going to put out to the audience. We obviously don't know who's actually listening necessarily. So if you have any specific questions, please do put them in the Q&A box, and I can take those to Gareth or ask them in this session. So we have got a couple of points that have been made, so I'll just call those out. And then I've got a couple of questions as well. So from Kirsty Buchanan, just focusing again on the support through interface with connecting academia and industry. There is a link there for any of those that are unaware of that. We've also had from Helena Ward at Creative Scotland, great, terrific thinking and advice, Gareth. And then a reference to the nature solving problems is great, but we're destroying nature, so new problems to solve. I do think that people do know what the problem is, but we can solve this. So yeah, just a reference there to what's happening with environment, and we know that's such a massive issue. So lots to reflect on there, Gareth. I think one of the areas that I'm interested in terms of the community that we have up here is that starting point for innovation. So if you're, somebody relatively small and you've got an idea and you're going through the process, I can relate to that myself with my own business, and also taking something where I now have the patent for the product. It's a long journey. And there are different stages along that way certainly when you're doing it on your own. I guess what sort of, if somebody, you probably do get people approach you, if somebody was approaching you with an idea but they're on their own, what sort of advice would you give them, in terms of which direction would they go? Should they try and take it to a company? Should they try and evolve it? What sort of things, what direction might you put them in?
It would very much depend on the type of idea. I mean, I'd encourage people to develop. There's a good argument for actually doing as much as you can yourself before you approach a company. There's risks in approaching companies, particularly if you don't have design protection or patent protection. We've talked about that. So patents are expensive, but there's other types of protection you can use that's much more cost effective. But I'd always encourage people to go as far as they can on their own. And your organisation, there are organisations out there that you can actually reach people who are doing similar things. And those like-minded people, they're the sort of people it'd be great to get around the table and to have a bit of a brainstorm and say, this is what I'm thinking of doing, and getting external input, because we can all become, we only have one point of view. The more points of view you have, I think that the more the options open up. But I'd encourage people to reach out to see if they can find like-minded people to work with. But I think you can do a lot of the, as I say, it doesn't take sometimes a lot of money or time to actually be able to articulate an idea. You don't need necessarily expensive, fully working prototypes. You can work up ideas and explore them, and build system sort of models and communicate that. Drawing and the visual communication of ideas. If you work on that doesn't actually cost a lot of money. It's more time, and that enables you to actually communicate ideas to other people, maybe manufacturers, maybe sort of commercial partners, and get feedback. There are sources of funding out there. We've managed to secure some Innovate funding, so that there are sources of funds out there. And again, local sort of, we have a local, it's a sort of entrepreneurial hub in Bath, and they've actually got some great staff there. I've been talking to them and they've steered me in the right direction. So I'm sure Joan will be able to put anyone up there in touch with all the resources that are out there. Yeah. But I'd encourage anyone who's starting off on that journey. I mean, if you feel you have it in you, I'd say pursue it. Do it. Once you actually start working for someone else. I worked for Dyson for a long time before I finally, after 15 years, actually sort of set out on my own. And I don't regret it. It's been a really interesting and exciting journey.
Excellent. Well, I think just on the back of that, for those in the Highlands and Islands region, there is support through HI. They're effectively working on, there's a new team, I think, forming around innovation. So do get in touch through XpoNorth, and we can put in put you in contact with High, or if you've already involved with High, obviously you can go there directly. But Gareth also mentioned Innovate UK. That's a national-wide fund that effectively supports innovation. It is quite difficult to get the money, as Gareth, I think when we spoke earlier, you've done it, you applied 3 times, was it?
Well, third time lucky, but we used a grant writing. There are companies that help write grants, and to be honest, I was very sceptical the first 2 times. And then after the sort of second rejection, I thought, well, I'll give them a go, and they delivered. So I'd recommend, if you are going down that route, it's worth considering, because it could save you a lot of time.
Excellent. Hazel Mansfield's popped in a question to you, Gareth. What big problem are you working on right now, if you're allowed to talk about it?
We're focused on water pollution. So we've done, I did a lot of work on washing machines. I worked for the world's probably most famous filtration company, but the problem we're looking at is just there's a lot of we treat rivers and the sea as like a tip, and it's wrong. Legislation's coming to tighten that up. So we're working with on various projects with various partners to actually improve that situation. I can't, unfortunately, talk too much more about that, because it's still, we're in the middle of developing sort of ideas. So it's reasonably, the technical part is reasonably confidential. But, I've spent long enough designing what I'd call, potential landfill products. I like to think that we design them well. But I think that, in answer to Helena's sort of point there, I think we need to focus more on addressing some of these big environmental issues, getting the brain power and getting business sort of focused on actually making things better. Not I think it's just stepping back and thinking, do we really need more? Is it always about more product and more sophistication, more technology? I don't think it is. I'm absolutely not interested in that. The things that motivate me are actually solving some of the big problems. So we've got a lot of work we're doing on water pollution. Next, we're going to be looking at laundry, so how to make the world's most effective washing machine. So hopefully this time next year we'll be able to show you pictures of that.
Excellent. I think one of the issues that I learned on my journey of innovation was about when to stop, when you've got an idea, and work out, as you said, if you're going to fail at something, fail quickly. And, and I think that's really good advice, because a lot of people get this idea in their head, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to find a way to do it. But actually, at some point, you have to step back and say, it doesn't work. Or as another route, as you've shown, is, well, what's the problem I'm trying to solve? Is there another way in? So I think that's really interesting learning, because people do get fixed on what they see as this solution to a problem, but actually it's recognizing when it may not work.
Well, it's interesting as well, because I started working for Dyson in '89, and he'd been, by then, I think he was, I don't know, in '91, that was 15 years he'd been working on that problem. So he built his prototypes in the 70s.
Wow.
The vacuum. He famously says, it took him 15 years to become an overnight success. And he was very determined and dogged. So there's a balance. I think if you really believe in your product, I think you should stick with it. But as you say, if you're pushing against a closed door, don't push harder. Just go and look for other doors, other ways in, other sort of avenues. And I think that's a much more productive use of your time.
Yeah. And then on that sort of growth side, so obviously reflecting back on the Dyson situation, where he was, obviously it was a small team, there was just a few of you, and then, now there's what, 30,000, is it?
3, 4, 5,000, who knows, it goes up.
Yeah. So, that growth journey, obviously you can look at obviously the success of the product, but also looking for funding there, whether you go out to investors. At what point do you bring in other people to help grow the product that you find?
Well, it's interesting. So I'm still wrestling with that. I haven't got the answer for that yet. We've self-funded everything to date. We're just reaching the point where we'll know whether we actually need to go for external funding. Dyson was an interesting example, though, because he was all self-funded. So the interesting thing about his business is he owns it. There's no shareholders as such that he has to answer to. And the benefit of that is he can take a very long view. So he was taking decisions 20 years ago that have actually led him to be where he is now. The problem with having external investors and shareholders sometimes is they're operating to a different timescale. Investors always talk about exit strategy. They've got like they want to leave with a multiple of their original investment, and that doesn't sit comfortably with building a long-term sustainable business. So I don't know what the answer is to that, but I'll let you know next year.
We'll compare notes. I'm still on that journey, but I think that's the thing. Is it's innovation is through at different stages within a company, whether it's individually, whether it's part of a larger organization. And you talked about the culture. You need to be in an environment, and we've all worked in different organizations where it's encouraged or not, and it's the ideal scenarios as you reflected on, that environment where open thinking, diversity, getting people around the table, that's so important. And the more we spend, I guess, now working from home, less around the table, you need to plan for those times so that ideas can bounce off each other and 1+1, etc.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? That's why I love that slide about the sort of the intersections and the multidisciplinary nature, because it's the interesting things happen at the boundaries. I'd love to see, I don't know why when we have technical companies, they're not employing artists and, writers and people like that who have just such a different take on things. And the more you mix it up, Raleigh was a great example that, they had dancers and they had philosophers and they had just such an incredible eclectic mix, but you put it all in. And it just there's some sort of magic happens when you mix it up, and that's the shame of the remote working, is you lose. It's the coffee machine conversations, the water cooler conversations. Someone mentions something that just it triggers something. So you've got to. I think if you can't meet people, just regular contact, that dialogue and that social interaction, I think really important.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, I think we're sort of coming towards the end. I don't know if anybody else on the panel, who's watching, wants to pop in a question. I know this one is being recorded and will be available to access for anyone who's registered. So if there's no other questions, I'm just going to say a really big thank you, Gareth. Really, really appreciate your time today and sharing all of this. It's been great to catch up after all this time too. So really good.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.